instructional time is the children's time. It isn't our time. And I do think we waste a lot of their time, and that's not a good thing. So, okay, back to where we were. So I said PA is one thing to teach. It's certainly not the biggest thing, but it has a place. It needs to be there. Letters. The ABCs. This one seems like it would be a no-brainer. We have tons of research going back a full century on the correlation of letter name knowledge with later reading achievement, and in fact, lots of other things. Letter name knowledge seems to tell us about something about these kids' learning ability. Alphabet knowledge is a significant predictor of later reading, even when controlling for age differences, SES differences, oral language differences, PA differences, IQ differences. But you know what? In all these years, we don't have studies showing whether teaching alphabet knowledge helps or not. Such studies just don't exist. What does exist that I think is very interesting is that there are studies that have looked at teaching PA with letters and without letters. And what you find is if you include letters, you increase the effectiveness of PA instruction. You almost triple it. So it seems to have a multiplier effect of some kind. So to me, that seems like a no-brainer that we want our kids not only to have instruction in PA, but again, in these early years, having instruction in the ABCs. And I don't think I need to say more than that. Phonics instruction. Now, phonics instruction has been controversial the whole time I've been in education. I started taking my first reading classes back in the 60s. First started teaching reading back in the 1960s. And phonics was either hated or somebody believed it had religious powers or something. I am a proponent of phonics instruction, but only for one reason. The research overwhelmingly says it helps. It's really, so as a first grade teacher, I taught it. As a director of reading, I mandated that my teachers teach it. To me, this is not a religious issue. It is an issue of what works for kids. Phonics refers to the instruction aimed at teaching the alphabetic system or the alphabetic principle. That is, that our words, our letters, represent sounds, not ideas. That means teaching kids sound-symbol correspondences, letter sounds and the letters, and how they match up, and the relationships between spelling patterns and pronunciations. Teaching kids to decode print to pronunciation, or sounding out, or however it is that you think of it. These studies that I've got cited here show you that kids can learn to read without phonics instruction. Wait, why are you showing us something that says that kids can learn without this? Because they learn better with it. They can learn without it if the kids succeed without phonics instruction. What these studies show is they succeed because they manage to figure out phonics. They figure out the decoding system. What these studies did is they took children in first grade, and you could still do this in those days. You had the situations. You literally could have first graders who were studying phonics, and you could have first graders who weren't getting any phonics instruction at all, at least at school, and compare them. And what they did in these studies is they went in every month and tested these boys and girls on word reading. And what they found was, for that whole first year, you could tell the difference in the kids in terms of which group they were in. You didn't have to know. If a little kid came to you to be tested on the words, if that youngster started guessing words that were, say, in the list of words that they were studying in the word group, lots of just not knowing what words were, you knew which group those kids were coming. You could tell who they were. If you had kids coming up with nonsense words at times, or sounding up, you knew they were phonics kids. By the time kids hit beginning second grade reading level, right? Couldn't tell the kids apart if they could read. You couldn't tell them apart. If they got to that beginning second grade reading level, they made the same kinds of mistakes. They did the same kinds of things when it came to reading. You couldn't tell them apart. They'd somehow, even without the explicit help, they'd figured it out. The reason why I talk about that is because I find so many teachers use that as their excuse for not teaching phonics. Gee, some of my kids figure this out anyway, so clearly you don't need it. But what the studies find, again and again and again and again, is let's get off the individual and start thinking of the group. You guys aren't responsible for one kid. You're responsible for all your first graders or whatever. The group does better on average. More kids succeed in learning to read, if you want to count it that way. We're working on those margins. The National Early Literacy Panel examined 70 studies on decoding instruction. Now, that also includes some of those ones with PA because they lumped them together. But they found that such instruction in preschool and kindergarten had moderate to large impacts on students' reading and spelling development and on various emergent literacy skills. The National Reading Panel examined 38 studies, and these were purely on phonics, and found that such teaching in grades K through 2 and with older remedial readers had a positive impact on decoding and fluency, and with the K2 kids, the ones we're talking about today, reading comprehension and spelling effects as well. Why do we teach phonics? Because kids do better in reading. They make faster progress. I can, if Ohio were providing you lunch today, we could, I know. But I'd suggest an experiment. I'd suggest that if they were, I would tell half the class where lunch was, and we wouldn't tell you guys. And we'd see what happened. And I think what you would see happen is, first of all, not everybody in this group would find lunch, even though I'd told them. Some of the people here would get there anyway, but on average, probably more of you guys would get your lunch. That's all we're talking about with phonics instruction. Our system is one where letters and combinations of letters represent sounds. Should we tell kids about that and let them know how that works, or should we just hope that they figure it out on their own and keep it as a secret? It won't disadvantage everybody, but it certainly will disadvantage some. And telling everybody doesn't always work either, guys. Phonics isn't 100% effective. Code-focused instruction, teaching kids that decoding, is absolutely critical. In fact, the benefits appear to be long-lasting. Just last summer, looking at studies, high school kids, where they've been tracking kids who got phonics in those early years, continuing to show an advantage, way after that kind of instruction has been discontinued. Effective phonics instruction was explicit and systematic. Multiple years of phonics instruction were better than single years. In most educational research, a long study is a school year. In phonics, we actually have a few studies where they follow kids through kindergarten and first grade and second grade and find, wow, these kids got an advantage in kindergarten and they added to the advantage in first grade and they got additional advantage in second grade. So we actually know that 3 years of phonics instruction is really quite beneficial. This is a tricky one. One of your audience mates here came up and was asking me about effective phonics programs for a specific group of kids. And let me start just putting this statement in context, and then I'll deal with the statement itself. And the context is we do not have studies where people take phonics program A and put it up against phonics program B and show that one of those does better. We have a ton of studies showing we're going to give these kids phonics, we're not going to give these kids phonics. In fact, the National Reading Panel, I think in those 38 studies, looked at like 20 different programs of instruction, and they all worked. Everything gave an advantage. And so I've got to say that virtually all programs of phonics that are explicit and systematic work with young children. And that's from the National Reading Panel and the What Works Clearinghouse. Now, the group I was being asked about is, what about kids with really low IQs? What about kids with mental disabilities? What about those kids? And, I would say the harder the learning for a particular child, for whatever reason, you're going to want a more thorough, and explicit phonics program in those years. And so, I don't have any data where I can say this phonics program is better than that, but there are certainly some that are more thorough. And I know there are groups. Are there special educators in the room? I'll make you guys mad for a minute. I'm very pro-phonics. But groups like the International Dyslexia Association, come out for particular phonics programs. They don't have any data showing that. So they do it on the basis of their theories and beliefs, and that's fine. Maybe they're even right. But as you can see, I'm avoiding doing stuff like that. I'm trying to tell you guys what the data actually seem to say rather than trying to get you to do a particular thing. No single phonics sequence did better than another. I know our U.S. Congress, when they saw our results, wanted to impose a national phonics sequence. And the reason was because we said there needed to be a sequence. This notion of systematic just simply means that there was actually a curriculum. One of the things that teachers were being told, maybe they're still being told, was that, phonics instruction's good, but it needs to be responsive to children's needs. You don't need a program. Programs are bad. What you need is responsive phonics. And what they meant by that is, as a teacher, you were to sort of know, this kid doesn't have his P sound and he needs it right now. Now I'll do some just-in-time teaching. And so they literally did studies where there were 3 groups. There'd be a group that didn't get phonics instruction. There'd be the group that would get that kind of opportunistic phonics instruction where the teacher would just respond to kids' needs. Sounds good, though. And they'd have the one where people would just follow in a program. And what they found was both phonics groups did better than the group that didn't get any phonics, but the one with systematic phonics instruction did better. And it wasn't a particular program. That wasn't the point, but a program. Gee, I'm teaching this sound today or this spelling pattern today. That means tomorrow I'm supposed to. You actually had a plan, and we're taking kids through it. And I can say, but no particular sequence. You need a sequence, you need a plan, but there isn't a particular one that this is the one that's good. And so, if you're looking for programs, I would say go look at what Works Clearinghouse says. Which ones do they say have a record of success? That would probably be the best thing you can do, but they all are likely to work. This is my bugaboo. This is one I'm gonna hit hard. Phonics instruction should include lots of opportunity for students to decode and encode words. I have this wonderful presentation, but kids actually have to be trying to figure out words. And that can be both on the spelling side and the reading side. Not long ago, I was working with I was observing a second grade classroom. And it was a rookie who was teaching, but she was supposed to do like a half an hour phonics lesson. So I got there at 10 o'clock. And by about 5 after 10, she had handed out this sheet, from her reading program, two-sided, so there were, really 2 pages of stuff to do. Each one of them had like 9 pictures on the side, and the kids had to go in and essentially write the first 2 letters that you heard, the blends. At 5 after 10, she kind of turned to me and went, she was done. Her half-hour phonics lesson was over. There was nothing more to be done. The kids hadn't read a single word. They hadn't sounded anything out. They hadn't tried to spell anything. They'd done these 2 little worksheets. And I'm not arguing against those worksheets. I don't care about the worksheets. Nothing else happened. Now, usually in an observation, I just sort of go, okay, let's go talk. But this one, it was just ridiculous. I mean, it was, what do we do with the other 25 minutes? And it's crazy. So I actually took over, which is not what I should be doing. And I didn't have any materials or anything, but what I had the kids do is I asked them to write down the names of all those pictures. I made them write them. And what was fascinating is they couldn't spell the blends. They were doing the little worksheet, but they weren't translating that into the spelling. They weren't actually doing anything with their decoding instruction. Most programs are better than that. They'll have some kind of decodable text as part of the lessons. They'll have something, for the kids to read, or word lists for them to try to figure out, or, dictations to take, or whatever. But for whatever reason, whatever they were doing was teaching phonics, had a system, but actually wasn't requiring the kids to do much of anything. And so I would really argue we want kids trying to read words and encode words using those phonics skills. And again, right out of your state standards, I'm not imposing anything on you. These are the phoneme-grapheme correspondences that are listed, and the examples. I don't know if I formatted this slightly differently, but I made no changes in this intentionally, I can tell you. Syllable patterns. So your state says you're supposed to teach those things in these years. I see no excuse for not doing it. I mandated it for my kindergarten through, my preschool through second grade teachers. If I were in your roles, I wouldn't hesitate to either teach it or mandate it or go, watch my teachers on it. We need to teach those kinds of things to kids. This one, I'm not going to talk about a whole lot, but it comes up as a question. Is it a good idea to teach high-frequency words? And my answer would be, yes, it is. And there's a little bit of research supporting that, but it's a lot more complicated than it sounds. And if anything, these days, with the help of some of our companies and so on, in a lot of schools, I think people are probably spending too much time on this. Words differ in their frequency in the language. Some words are used a lot, others appear rarely. Depending on the list, the most common English words are words like of or the kinds of words that show up in every text. In English, the 300 most frequent words in the language and their derivations make up about 75% of all the running words you see in text. So if, for example, if you took your morning newspaper and went through and crossed out all these first 300 words, you'd end up crossing about 75% of the text out. One of the things that you're going to find is those really highly frequent words tend to be some of the oldest words in the English language. And what that often means is their spellings are derived from what the monks did in the 11th century. So, for example, the word of is the only word in the English language out of our hundreds of thousands of words, only word in our English language where an F is associated with a V. But there was a monk back in the 11th century who, when he was copying, he miscopied. He made an error. And there's no spell checker on those manuscripts. And he put an F instead of a V. And unfortunately, his became the manuscript that got used, to copy from. Just an accident of history. One of those odd, interesting little stories that, what it means is we've got this weird spelling of F that isn't generalizable to anything else. So learning the word of is probably better to memorize than to try to apply phonics to it. If you have an F in a two-letter word that ends with O, that starts with O, then, it makes a V, no, just of. However, having said that, when you look at how words are learned, you start to say, hey, wait a minute, it's a good idea to have kids learn some words like this just as words, but do we really want to do what some programs are now telling schools? Oh, our program's better than the other ones because we have 95. We teach the kindergarten kids 95 words. If you look at what the best experts we have in those reports, like prevention of reading difficulties, what they recommend for kindergarten kids is maybe 15 to 20 words, including their name. So it's, that's not a lot of words to learn. And me, in my personal practice, In my schools and school districts, I usually push for, I want the kids to know the first 100 words, those most 100 frequent words by the end of first grade. And yeah, that includes some of those ones they picked up in kindergarten, except for their name. And by the end of second grade, it'd be great if all the kids knew 300 words, the first 300. That sounds crazy, that sounds like a lot, but here's the thing. Do you know how words are learned? Do you really think they're learned through memorization? What we find is, and you know, people on the National Reading Panel, the person who headed up the alphabetics group, Linnea Airy, would tell you that learning these high-frequency words, most of it, a good deal of it, comes out of the phonics instruction. It's not a memorization task. Any of you who have taught little kids to read know that initially they have a heck of a time, even the really smart ones have a heck of a time holding words in memory. You can teach them, they seem to know them, and tomorrow they're gone. Or they learn the little smudge in the corner of the card, and oh, that one is the. However, over time, as they learn decoding, as they learn the spelling patterns, as they learn the letter sounds, something magical happens. They start picking up sight words like that. And in fact, they're not sight words. They just are being processed so quickly, they look like they're sight words. They're doing exactly the same thing that they're doing with all the other words. They're just doing it faster and easier. And so, no, you're not going to have your kindergarten kids sitting down and trying to memorize 75 words. The research wouldn't support that. But memorizing a handful of words makes sense because it allows you to start reading and you don't have to wait for everything to be in place. That allows you to get the whole process going. But a good deal of that memorization, and you know, so 100 words for first grade, that's the 100 words that I'm worried about in the high frequency list. The fact is they're going to read probably another 500 words that they can just simply decode, you know, all those CVC words, you know, can and pan and, you know. And so by the end of first grade, kids are going to know hundreds and hundreds of words. I just want to make sure that that first 100 is there. And like I say, there are studies showing that sight vocabulary matters and that you can teach sight vocabulary. Sight vocabulary refers to words that someone can read as if they're not decoding. It appears like they're effortlessly pulling them back from memory and recognizing them as a whole. But when you actually watch their eyes, you know, on a camera or study what's going on in their brain, they ain't just pulling it back from memory. Given the value of high-frequency words, it would make sense that students learn these as sight words. In other words, should be able to respond to those words really quickly. But student memory for words is dependent upon the decoding. Phonics makes the words stickier. They stick in memory. Sight vocabulary is, to a great degree, an outcome of decoding. I'd count it as part of my phonics instruction. Teaching sight vocabulary can improve fluency and comprehension. Teaching words by focusing attention on the order of letters, not mnemonics or pictures. Working with them both in isolation and in context seems to be essential. So that's a really small part of reading instruction. And I talked about that already. And here are the first 100 words. Oh, isn't that nice? Everything I've talked about so far has dealt with words or parts of words, right? How do we essentially get the word off the page? Really important stuff. In my schools, and this isn't research-based, this is just a command decision that I made, I wanted 25% or approximately 25% of our instructional time devoted to words. So if you're a first grade teacher or a second grade teacher and you're buying what I said, you're given 2 hours a day or you're given 3 hours a day of reading and writing instruction, that means a half an hour to 45 minutes is dedicated to the stuff I was just showing you. And that might not sound a lot to you, but think about it. That would mean kids would be getting things like PA and phonics about 90 to 135 hours in kindergarten, in first grade. That's hundreds of hours devoted to that kind of teaching. And for most kids, that's going to be plenty. Some are going to need more than that, admittedly. Another thing that research supports the teaching of is oral reading fluency. Oral reading fluency refers to the ability to read text accurately, quickly, and with proper expression. Accurately means you read the author's words. First graders are really good at making up their own words. They'll read you what it should say. They're the ones who look at, crest on the side of the tube and say it says toothpaste. Or they see CORNFLAKES, that says cereal. Right? They're great at doing that kind of thing. Now, you have to actually learn to read the author's words. That's a big deal in first grade. And you have to do it quickly. And some of my friends get upset with that word quickly because it sounds too much like speed reading or hurrying. And I don't mean that. They have to be able to read text with facility. They have to be able to read text. I'm not talking individual words here. I'm talking text, sentences and paragraphs and pages of information. But they have to do them so quickly that they're not, that decoding those words isn't taking up much of their mental resources. Right? It has to be that easy. Speed, no. If a kid sounds hurried, they're not working on fluency. It should sound like language. Little kids talk more slowly certainly more slowly than I do, but more slowly than older kids. And so obviously they're not going to be as fluent. They're not going to read as quickly. You don't expect them to. And with proper expression, it again has to sound like language. And quite simply, especially in these primary grades, what that means is you pause in the right places. You stop, at the end of, where there's punctuation. You stop where there's, a meaningful pause. And this is a very rough kind of overlapping order of how they develop as well. Kids tend to get accurate initially, but they often do that at the expense of speed. If you give me long enough, I can sound anything out. Oh, that's not what we're talking about. If it's going to take you that long to sound it out, then you don't have any mental resources left over to think about the ideas. So it's got to be kind of easy for you to do this. That's how good you have to be at it. And you have to make it sound like language. I went to a school district. I shouldn't tell this story. I went to a school district in Massachusetts, and they had me do a professional development thing with the teachers on fluency, and the school was doing all this cool fluency stuff. And we had had such a nice day. But at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they brought me a young man, little first grader, a little African-American boy, and they said, Henry has the highest Dibble score of anybody in our school, in our district, And they said, we'd like you to read to Dr. Shanahan, would you? And it was like he got like 700 words correct per minute. Had no idea what he was reading. And my response is, that's just terrible. They didn't like me as much afterwards. That is not what the research is asking us to do. That makes no sense. It's not that kind of speed. It's in facility. It's moving through this stuff. National Reading Panel reviewed 52 studies, found that oral reading fluency instruction improved decoding, word reading, oral reading fluency, and reading comprehension in grades 1 through 4, and with remedial students, grades 1 through 12. And when I look at the data that Tim Rosinski's brought forth from high schools here in Ohio and from colleges here in Ohio, I would suggest that the research says teaching these things at those levels, but it means even going beyond that for a lot of the kids in this state. Fluency is the best predictor of reading comprehension in the lower grades. 73% of comprehension variance is explained by fluency in second grade. What that would mean is if among your 7-year-olds, if we could make all the kids equal in fluency, get all those low fluent kids up to where the really good fluent ones are, you'd reduce the differences in reading comprehension by 73%. That's huge. Now, it doesn't continue to be that important, in part because more and more kids get to ceiling levels of fluency. They get as fluent as you need to be to understand text and to read well. But even by 8th grade, it's explaining 25% of the differences. So fluency instruction makes sense. The National Literacy Panel found that oral reading fluency was important with second language learners too. And, I said that with PA. I don't remember if I said it with phonics, but I should have if I didn't. And it's also true of fluency, and it's also true of comprehension strategies, which I'll get to in a couple minutes. But what I want to point out to you is, how many of you are responsible for second language kids? Oh, okay, considerable number. Let me do this. All of these things I've talked about so far are beneficial to second language learners in learning to read English. But what you have to know going in is the payoff from this kind of instruction for those children is lower than the payoff for native speakers. So if teaching phonics gives native speakers this kind of a boost, second language kids only get that much of it. Same thing with PA, same thing with fluency. So I don't want to oversell this stuff. What that would mean is if we gave second language kids exactly what we gave first language kids, you're guaranteeing that they're going to stay behind. Why don't these things have the same payoff? The honest answer is we don't know. But the best analyses of these, and I think I did those, the best analysis of this would suggest these things only work for these kids to the level of English that they have. And so, for most kids, if you can sound out a word, that turns it into an oral word that you have in your language, and then you can interpret it. But what if you don't have that word in your language yet? Now I can sound it out, but it's just like a nonsense word. To me, doesn't mean a thing. So it doesn't give me that payoff. What I just said about phonics and PA and fluency and comprehension strategies is true. Guess what happens when I teach vocabulary? Payoff for everybody, but guess who gets the biggest payoff? Yeah, the second language learners. And so, if anything, what I'm presenting to you should be arguing for isn't, oh, that's the magic ingredient. They're all magic ingredients. You need them all to make any of them work. Let's see. Effective instruction in oral reading fluency. Engage kids in oral reading with feedback and repetition and with texts that were relatively difficult. I am not talking about having round-robin reading. This is, I work on fluency. How do you work on fluency? I call on kids to read a paragraph to everybody. Think about it. If you have 30 kids in a classroom, and I don't know if that's big for you or small for you, but if you have 30 kids in a classroom, and you were going to do round-robin reading every day, and you gave every child a minute of reading. Most kids don't get a minute of reading, but you're going to do that. We're going to spend 30 minutes, and every child's going to get a minute of reading. It would mean by the end of the year, you would have given everybody 3 hours of reading practice. Boy, that's going to sure raise your reading scores. That's going to help the job situation in Ohio. Man, employers are going to be flocking. 3 hours of reading instruction? That's wonderful. Thanks. Hope you do that for my kids. If you did paired reading, you have two kids sitting side by side reading to each other and the teacher circulating and overseeing that, you end up with 45 hours a year for the same amount of instructional minutes. Would you rather have 45 hours of reading practice or 3 hours of reading practice? Just think it through on that. Could you imagine if you could do that with your retirement money? Increase it by that percentage? I think nobody would be here. Instructional approaches like paired reading, repeated reading, reading while listening, neurological impressive all worked. In a way, oral reading frequency is a kind of a mashup of both fast decoding and initial reading comprehension. I mean, how do you know where to put the pauses? You're doing a kind of a first wave interpretation of the text. It's not a deep thinking, but you're able to figure out things like homonyms. Is it desert or dessert? Things like that. You are monitoring the meaning of it. It's why kids can read a text with higher accuracy than they can typically read a word list, because there's some meaning to depend upon. And so oral reading fluency is kind of both. It's kind of a bridge, and I would put some considerable time into it. Vocabulary instruction, which I mentioned, is another one that's been studied. National Reading Panel reviewed 45 studies and found that direct instruction in words or the meaningful parts of words had a positive impact on reading comprehension, and those studies were from grades 1 through 12. And I personally don't think it's too much to generalize down to kindergarten and preschool from that vocabulary development's important then too. National Literacy Panel showed that special importance of vocabulary to second language learners. The effect sizes there are bigger than they are for first language learners. Vocabulary has the opposite relationship with reading comprehension that fluency had. So I suggested, boy, with little kids, fluency is almost the whole game, right? It explains most of the variance. But as kids go through school, as they learn more and more reading, the importance of fluency goes down relative to other things. It explains less and less of the variation in comprehension. Vocabulary goes the other way. With young kids, it isn't that important. That's not true. Vocabulary instruction isn't that important. Vocabulary is important, but think if what I said to you earlier, that a typical first grader by the end of the year is probably going to know 100 of those high-frequency words and can maybe decode easily another 500 or 600 words. How many words do you think a typical 6-year-old comes to school with? The estimates are around 5,000 to 10,000 words. And the words that we usually try to teach little kids to read are words that we hope are going to be in their oral language. And so, wow, this kid picked up 600 words this year, all of which were in his oral language. Vocabulary isn't going to explain much difference in reading comprehension in those cases. But what happens in second grade? Well, we teach them even more words. And third grade, by the time you're in about fourth grade, the texts are really starting to present words that kids don't even have in their oral language. And so vocabulary gets increasingly important as you go up through the grades. So you can, as fluency importance is going down, vocabulary importance is going up. Kind of an interesting pattern. Effective instruction in vocabulary, explicit teaching, again, not just hoping the kids get it. Kids do learn words from reading and watching television and talking to their friends, but we can sweeten that with some direct instruction on words that we think are particularly valuable. That instruction needs to be rich and thorough. In other words, not just sort of giving kids a definition, but really kind of going through a word very thoroughly. For example, I'll just take a kind of a nonsense word, rope. I want to teach these kids the word rope. They don't know the word rope. I'm going to teach it. I can give a definition, I guess. Rope is some kind of entwined fiber, right? That we use as a tool or whatever. Okay, well, let's think about, can somebody use rope in a sentence that shows the meaning? Not like, he told me to use the word rope. Anybody? Okay, I played tug of war with my friends while holding a rope. Okay, that helps me. Can somebody tell me what kind of a word it is grammatically? It's a noun. Okay, very good. Let me see. What category would this go into? What's the, if we were grouping things like fruits and toys and bodies of water, what would you put rope into? What would be its category? Where does that belong? It's an object, but it's a tool. Could be a tool. Okay, so we'll say it's a tool. Could you draw a picture of a rope if I had a whiteboard up here? Okay, so we could draw a picture of a rope. I'd like people to think really hard. Do you know a rope personally? Do you have one in your own personal experience? Like what? What are you talking about? You have one in your personal experience? Oh, she has a boat, and so that's how she ties her boat. So she can think of a specific rope. Who else had a rope? Jump rope. Oh, gosh, a lot of classrooms have jump ropes, of course. You teach second grade, you'd better have about a half dozen jump ropes, or your kids aren't going out to recess today. What I'm trying to get at is, instead of just giving a definition, we're going to really dig in on this word. Oh, another one. I want to compare a rope with a string. What's the difference? Bigger, thicker, entwined, stronger. Okay, sure. What I'm getting you to do is compare it with other words, put it in categories, think of it as a part of speech, use it, draw it. Could we act out a rope? So when we talk about richness or thoroughness of vocabulary, it's not, oh yeah, he means have them look it up in the dictionary, or it's more than that. Focused on relationships among words. I just started doing a little of that with you. Personalization, I did some of that. I made you think of ropes that you knew personally. Review. You go back to those words again and again. It's not enough that you presented them this week. Oh, we looked at some words before we read our story this week. When are you going to look at those words again? Never. It's usually not how words get learned. And the kids should be dealing with these words in lots of ways. That is, through their reading, through their listening, through their speaking, and through their writing. And programs do better if they do those, and other kinds of media, like drawing and so on. Programs do better if they have those kinds of features. No excuses in any of the grades to not give vocabulary instruction. Now, I'm getting in trouble. Reading comprehension. The National Reading Panel reviewed 204 studies of reading comprehension strategy instruction in grades K through 12. Overwhelmingly, we found that teaching comprehension strategies was a positive, beneficial thing. Flash forward several years, and the What Works Clearinghouse was going to do one of those practice guides that I was talking about yesterday, where the experts can say whatever they want. I headed a panel for them with some folks who you probably know, Joe Torgeson and Nell Duke and David Pearson and folks like that. And we got in a room, and we talked about if we were going to focus on reading comprehension, not across the whole system, but just K through 3, what would we recommend to teachers? What would we recommend to school districts? And everybody said, comprehension strategies. You'd want to teach comprehension strategies, just like the National Reading Panel found. And then when we were leaving the room, I'm talking to Nell Duke, and some of you know Nell, and Nell and I are going, it's really great that that's on there, and we really agree with that, but I wonder if there's any research K3 on it. There's a ton of research on this. Remember, 204 studies, but done with What Works won't allow you to say it works with kindergarten kids unless you've done it with kindergarten kids. Not everybody agrees to that standard, but What Works Clearinghouse holds to that. So our fear was, we're going to come back and say, yeah, you teach comprehension strategies, and What Works is going to say, and there's no evidence supporting this. We were shocked to find that What Works Clearinghouse said two things. They said, one, the teaching of comprehension strategies in grades K through 3 is a practice with high research support. And two, there's even high research support for the ways of teaching it. That's kind of cool. We were very pleased and maybe a little surprised. What Works Clearinghouse determined that gradual release of responsibility instruction was an effective method for improving reading comprehension with primary grade kids. In other words, that notion of the teacher models a particular strategy, the kids then do it through some kind of guided practice with the teacher. At some point they do it with more distant practice, and then eventually they do the thing on their own. That actually works for teaching kids to do this. What strategies am I talking about? Well, the ones that have been studied with little kids are summarization. This is the notion of when you're reading a text, you stop from time to time and try to, or actually when you're listening to something like what I've been doing with you, you stop from time to time and see if you can summarize what the author's told you, what the presenter has said. And if you can't remember some of it, you can go back and get the information or ask the question or whatever. Summarization is very powerful, increases people's recall and comprehension. questioning, asking questions of yourself about what you just read or what you're reading, and then seeing if you can answer the questions. And if you can't, again, you do something about that. So it's almost sort of like a self-quizzing, monitoring, paying attention to whether you're understanding a text. You know, with all the emphasis that I was giving earlier to things like phonics, kids can get the idea, if we're not careful, that reading is just about sounding out words, or the fluency is just about, being able to make a text sound a certain way. But of course, those are tools you use to help you understand a text. And so you need to pay attention to whether something makes sense or not. I remember many years ago, my oldest daughter, when she was a little girl, she wanted me to read with her. She'd just gotten a new stack of books out of the library. And I had something to do. I said, when I finish this, I'll come to you, but you go read on your own for a bit. And she did. I came over at some point, and I said, how are you doing? She said, great, I'm on page 37. I said, oh, really, what's it about? She said, I don't know. She was just happy to be reading it. And that's nice, but that isn't what we're going for. And so you need to recognize when you're not understanding and then do something about it. And there are a whole bunch of steps you can take to fix it. We have 17 studies on that across the grades showing that you can teach kids to monitor and their comprehension goes up. Visualizing what you're reading about. Story mapping. That learning that story structure is a real powerful one with little kids. But multiple strategies are most effective. Things like reciprocal teaching, where you teach kids to predict, you teach them to summarize, you teach them to ask questions, and you teach them, what's the one I'm forgetting? Clarify. Thank you, clarify. I'm an idiot. So those are some things that I can tell you. And writing. We have research on this too. And you're going, well, yeah, but it's driving readers. I think they're going to emphasize the reading part of this. Let me first just make a pitch for the importance of writing. Writing's a good thing to have kids know how to do. All that stuff I was saying yesterday about jobs, some of those jobs are tied to being able to write. So economically, that matters. There are health benefits tied to writing as well as reading and so on. So frankly, if it didn't fit today's talk, but you just cared about writing, it belongs in the curriculum. It's not why it's on my list today. Given that we're emphasizing striving readers and that you're trying to build up reading achievement and you're testing their reading on all this stuff, let me emphasize that the reason why writing is here is because reading and writing are closely correlated. Reading and writing can explain about 75% of the variation in each other. We have a meta-analysis of more than 100 studies that looks at the impact of writing activity on reading comprehension. And what those studies overwhelmingly tell us is that writing activity is hugely impactful on reading comprehension. In fact, 93% of the effects were positive and statistically significant. Writing about text had a bigger impact on learning than reading text alone did, than reading a text and rereading it did, or than reading text and discussing it did. That's pretty cool. And of course, these studies only focused on reading comprehension. There's a whole body of research on the impacts of writing on spelling and on decoding. Because with these little kids, when they're trying to learn letter sounds and they're trying to figure out phonemic awareness, man, if you're trying to figure out how to spell a word, you've got to think of every phoneme, right? It's terrific phonemic awareness practice. Essentially, writing adds something really important. When it comes to word recognition, it forces you to look at words more thoroughly and more explicitly, so you really learn those spelling rules and those patterns and so on. So I would really argue for any plan of instruction would have writing. Now, the way I dealt with all this stuff in Chicago, because that's a bunch of that's a long list, and it leaves a bunch of stuff out that you might want to see that we need to talk about. But essentially, what I did is divided that group into 4 things. I said we needed to spend our time on words, and including word meaning. So I lumped vocabulary, not with comprehension where we usually put it, but I threw it into Anytime you can take a word out of a text or you can break a word down into its parts, I don't care if it's a morphological breakdown or a spelling breakdown, that's word work. And we're going to spend a quarter of our time studying words, both the decoding of them and the meaning of them and the spelling of them. I said we would spend a quarter of our time on fluency. I said we would spend a quarter of our time on reading comprehension. And I said we'd spend a quarter of our time on writing. What that meant is, kids were getting huge amounts of instruction in all of those things. Anything missing from the list that you're surprised about or would like to see on the list? How about language? Wouldn't you love to see language on that list? And the reason language isn't on there is because language turns out to have a much more complicated relationship with reading, especially in the years that we're talking about here, than you might think. Let me tell you a little story. The National Early Literacy Panel, when it was looking at phonics studies, and I wish I'd pulled those slides. They're on my website. But essentially, we identified 299 studies, almost 300 studies, that had gone in and tested some skill or ability with little kids. Sometime, the latest they could do this would be the beginning of kindergarten or any time earlier in their life. So, this could be something they tested when they were 4 or something they tested when they were 3. Most of the time it was beginning of kindergarten or sometime when they were 4. And then you use those data to try to predict reading achievement sometime later, as early as the end of kindergarten, but any time after that, including 2nd grade, 5th grade, whatever. And we came up with a whole list of skills that predicted decoding ability, that predicted spelling ability, that predicted reading comprehension. And one of the ones we thought, we had a prediction. We predicted that language, oral language development measured, in those preschoolers and kindergarten kids would be a big predictor of reading. It probably wouldn't have much relationship with decoding, but it would have a big relationship with reading comprehension. Makes sense, right? So we ran the data. And we came back and found language explained 9% of the variation in decoding. That was, if you make all those little kids equal in language, their decoding skills would, we said we didn't think it would be much related to decoding. So then we looked at the comprehension data, predicting later reading comprehension, and oral language explained 9% of the variation. It wasn't any better than it was doing with decoding. Now that surprised us. If it should surprise you. Our team didn't give up on that, though. They said, gee, there's something wrong here. Let's break these data down even more thoroughly. So the National Early Literacy Panel broke out all the different ways that the studies had measured oral language in those little kids. Maybe that was making a difference. The most common measure of oral language that is used in those years is the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test or something like it. And this, the preschool people know what I'm talking about. And this is given multiple ways. If it's given to a group, we do something like give the kid 4 pictures, and we'll say, rake. Mark the picture or touch the picture of the rake. The kid just has to pick one of the 4 pictures. They don't have to say a word. They just have to find. Or you can do it the other way. You can say, here's a picture. What is this? And the kid is supposed to use expressive vocabulary and say, rake. Well, what we found was that measure is not terribly well related to later reading achievement. And so when we moved that aside and separated out other kinds of measures, so for example, a number of studies did more comprehensive looks at language. They did things like they included vocabulary, but they also included listening comprehension. They might have included some kind of cohesion measure where you sort of see if you could fill in the blanks, maybe some kind of a syntactic or grammatical measure. When you started having multiple measures of language that didn't just get at vocabulary, all of a sudden, well, it doesn't change the relationship of language to decoding, but it changes the relation of language, early language, to later reading comprehension. It explains about 50% of the variance, which is huge. What that tells me is that initially language is not all that important when kids are first starting to read, but it's like a time bomb. It's going to get more and more crucial. And the notion that we can just sort of wait on it is maybe not such a great idea. But I don't have a single study beyond the vocabulary stuff that shows, and with second language kids, you can certainly show teaching English improves their reading. But with first language kids, I don't have a single study where somebody has gone in, improved the kid's language through some kind of intervention or teaching, and then was able to measure an outcome on reading. Now, it's usually because they just didn't do it. They didn't try. There are studies like that going on and have been going on. And guess where? Columbus, Ohio. Yeah, right here. So you guys are in a hotbed of that. But I won't put it on my list until I have such a study. But I'm not stupid. I'm going to hedge my bets. I'm not going to, with first language kids, I'm not necessarily going to have an oral language time. But I'm going to make sure there's a lot of good oral language support for my kids in my teaching. We did a study just recently, just reported it a few months ago, did it a while ago for the Department of Education, where we collected data on more than 1,000 classrooms, preschool through third grade, 4 half days of observation in each. So one of the largest observational studies ever done. And I can tell you that in language environments, it's a very mixed bag. I feel a little bad giving you a lecture with like 250 people in the room, but frankly, to get this information out, and given the setup of the room and the number, this is about as well as I can do, guys, and I apologize, but that's it. It's not the same in a preschool classroom or a kindergarten classroom. So why is it that out of 15 minutes of observation, we see an average of about 13.6 minutes of teacher talk? Why do we see kids' conversations about academic things, either with each other or with the teacher, such a tiny proportion of the time? And so there are things that teachers do well. They ask a lot of questions. They ask a lot of open-ended questions. Not perfect, but a lot. They give kids sufficient wait time to answer those larger. So teachers do a number of things that support language, but it is something I think we have to pay attention to. Not as a curriculum goal, per se, right now, but as part of the support system that we provide. I think that's reasonable. A second one like that I would really emphasize is knowledge of the world. That science knowledge and social studies information. I hate when I hear that a school has cut their social studies program because they're going to have more reading instruction. Why would we do that? One of the things that we know about reading comprehension is it depends on your knowledge. That's a big part of reading comprehension, is connecting that new information with the old information. But I can show you that more knowledgeable people become better readers and all that kind of stuff. Correlations are there. And we have studies showing that it is part of the process. But I don't have a single study showing if we intervene here and increase kids' world knowledge, do a kind of, cultural literacy program or something, it raises reading achievement. I mean, that's the theory. There are no such studies. And so I won't put it on the list, but can anybody give me a good excuse why we wouldn't make sure that the texts that we are teaching reading comprehension or listening comprehension with wouldn't have rich information that we wanted the kids to learn too? I mean, shouldn't we be looking at our instruction not just in terms of things like the Dibble scores on oral reading frequency, which I do use? Why aren't we looking at also, in addition to that, how much of the social studies information from those texts that the kids were able to remember and that they held for the whole report card marking? Why aren't we making that increase of knowledge part of our issue? Not as a special thing that we teach, but through the rest of our curriculum and through our reading. So those kinds of things aren't on the list, not because they aren't important, but because we have absolutely no evidence that teaching them gives kids a clear benefit. So that will make some of you happy and some of you not so happy. But so let me do the last piece of this, and I can do this fast. I told you there were three things that mattered: amount of instruction, what we taught, and then how the quality of that teaching. And I gave you my definition of that. Let me show you some of the types of things. This is not meant to be exhaustive, though I've certainly grabbed some of the big ones. If you look at John Hattie's book, where he looks at all those different meta-analyses, and while I disagree with some of John's interpretations, this one I think is a no-brainer that he's right. He finds of all those things that teachers can do in a classroom, the one that makes the biggest difference is having clear purposes for the instruction. Purposes that the youngsters know. I visit classrooms a lot. One of my first questions for the kids is, what are you doing and why are you doing it? Or as my friend Doug Fisher, he goes up and, what are you learning? Kids often are doing activities and they have no idea why. They're not trying to learn anything. You're going to be a much more successful teacher in teaching anything I just talked about if the kids understand what it is that they're trying to accomplish. If you see a teacher not explaining that kinds of things at the beginning of a lesson, that's a problem. If the kids can't tell you, that's a problem. Those are things that we can address through professional development and supervision and good hiring practices. I would also argue, I made a big point out of it in phonics lessons, that the kids should be reading words and spelling words. I'm going to say the same thing. In writing, kids should be writing a lot. In reading comprehension, kids should be reading a lot. In fluency, kids should be reading a lot. It doesn't make any sense to do lessons where you're teaching reading comprehension and nobody reads a word. But I see that all the time. And not just with little kids, but obviously we're here about the little kids today. Through your system, it's not uncommon. I go to a middle school and they're getting ready to read a book and they use the whole 45 minutes. There's no reading. I can't give you a specific time that comes out of research any more than I can give you a specific amount of time that's the appropriate amount of reading instruction. I told you earlier, I came up with those things in a kind of an arbitrary way, but they're more time than what my schools were using, so I saw it as a good thing. Well, this is, what I've been asking teachers to experiment with, what if you said in a comprehension lesson, 50% of it would be the kids reading? So if I'm going to spend a half an hour on reading comprehension, or we're going to group it, do an hour a day, then what if they had to read 15 minutes of that half hour? What would that do? Or in a fluency lesson, if they had to read 15 minutes of that. Or in a decoding lesson, if decoding words and decoding decodable text and doing the dictations and the spelling, what if that took half the lessons? I have a feeling we'd have a lot more kids who could do these things. Thoroughness or intensity of instruction. And I think I mentioned that study earlier in PA where they taught the lessons whole class. But then they monitored who was learning. They'd come in with, in this case, dibbles, test them a few times a year. And they would identify who what wasn't succeeding with the instruction. And then they wouldn't send the kids someplace else or put them in something else. What they were doing is having the same teacher reteach those kids in smaller groups. So let's advantage the situation, give them some extra minutes. Got to steal it from the rest of the kids. We're going to use exactly the same curriculum, exactly the same materials. We're just taking those kids through it again. The difference in their schools that are doing that and other Chicago schools that we compared them with, the average Chicago school, 54% of the kids are hitting those Dibbles benchmarks by the end of kindergarten. In those schools, it's 92%. Yeah, but it's not, we didn't change the curriculum. We changed the time a little bit, but it was really kind of an intensity. We're not going to let those kids fall through. We're going to, teach things till we succeed and so on. The amount of interaction. I can tell you, if I ever visit your schools and I'm looking at how good they are, the first thing I'm going to look at is how much instruction kids are getting. But a number of my colleagues, this would be the thing they'd look at. How much interaction among the kids, how much interaction teacher and kids. I know, again, research on this is very supportive, that more interaction, more kid involvement is better than less. And so I've given a terrible lesson in those terms today. I was watching a lesson, I think this was last year. It's in Indiana, and very embarrassing situation. I go into this kindergarten, and the teacher's got the group, and it had to be January because they were reading about Martin Luther King, and you'd never read about Martin Luther King any other time in a school year. But she had the kids on the carpet, and she's reading this story, and she reads the whole damn story, and gets to the end of it, and asks a few questions of the kids. And I do a lot of observing, but I got to tell you, for whatever reason, I was having a heck of a time this morning staying awake. And I don't mean I was a little tired or, I'm not using hyperbole. I mean I was literally trying to sleep and was fighting it. And, it was just miserable. And it was a terrible lesson. It was so boring. And the kids were just kind of listless, and it was just a dead. And the minute it was over, I was so happy to be up and be able to move around and get out of there. And I went to the next classroom, and this almost never happens. She was teaching the exact same lesson. And I thought, I'm going to die, except it wasn't the exact same lesson. I went, she still had the kids grouped up on the carpet. They were all sitting in the same thing. These kids were not off task. They were all there, just like in the first room. Teacher was sitting in the little chair in front of them. She had the same book, took through the same thing. But what she did is she would read like a 2-page spread, and then talk to your partner about it. They'd do a pair share, everyone talk, and then she'd ask a question, and they'd give a bunch of answers. And she took them through it like that all the way to the end, and I had no trouble staying awake at all. It was exactly the same lesson, but with a lot more interaction in the same amount of time, and she was getting more learning. So it's not just the content or the time. There are these quality differences. The depth of information. Are we going to higher levels of thought, or is it just a superficial read? Quality of explanations matters. Some teachers give better explanations than others. There are studies where they actually go in and train teachers to give better explanations, and reading comprehension goes up. Kind of interesting. Motivation certainly matters. Like I said earlier, it's always nicer to have the kids working towards you than working against you. Trying to learn whatever it is you're teaching rather than trying to resist whatever you're doing. I told you, I want to make sure you guys understand that despite the fact that I'm university-based and I'm old, so I'm not in this stuff every day anymore, I want to make sure you know that I do understand education. Before you can leave this room, there has to be an exam. We do testing, right? That's what education's about. I have a test for you. How many things make a difference in kids' learning, academic learning? What's supposedly the biggest one? Then what? Then what? If you make those 3 things work for your kids, if you explicitly go after those, every decision, every single decision you make, whether it's writing a grant like the one you're being asked to work on, whether it's deciding whether to change a bus schedule, whether it's buying a new core program, whether it's setting up a new set of interventions, whether it's changing how you deliver your science instruction, you ought to look every single time and say, what will this do to the amount of instruction we're giving to our boys and girls in literacy? Will it reduce it in any way? Will it keep it the same? Will it increase it? If it'll increase it, you want to do it. If it'll decrease it, you better find an alternative. And I'd say the same thing about the kind of, well, I have some teachers who don't like teaching some of the things you had, and they're going to be unhappy part of the time. Because it isn't for them, it's for the kids. Well, wait a minute, but what if I want to teach this, using a different program? I didn't say programs made that kind of difference. It wasn't, program A is this much better than program B. Some of them might be, but we don't have that kind of data, so I can't tell you that. But I can tell you that the programs that are making sure kids get a lot of instruction in all those things that I was listed up there will often have an impact on achievement because they get teachers to spend more time teaching these things. Gee, our old program didn't do much with vocabulary. This one does a lot. Yeah, that could actually change achievement because now the teachers have more support to do it. They can't just make it up on their own all the time. Folks, last thing I have to say. Several years ago, I was presenting my framework of these 3 things and the time thing that I was sharing, and got to the end, and this was like an all-day presentation, and there was an African-American woman as old as the hills sitting over here all day, never said a word. And it was very interactive. It was a smaller group than this, maybe 30 people, and so a lot of give and take over a 5 or 6 hour period. But she never said a word. She had been teaching 60 years. I mean, she was one of the oldest teachers in our state. But at the end, when I was about to hear and going to finish up, her hand went up very slowly, but her hand went up. And she said, "Dr. Shanahan, what you told us today, we all already know. Why aren't we doing it?" That's what I'm going to leave you with, folks. You know it. Are we going to do it? Thank you so much.